Hello and welcome to Class 3 of the Library Reference Model. Today we're going to be talking more about authorities as well as changes that may be on the way for serials. So we'll be talking about all of that today. Just as a reminder, we'll have the class session each week. We will have weekly discussion, and thank you all for the great weekly discussion. Keep it up. It's been, we've had some great conversations, some very enlightening conversations, and a lot of food for thought. So keep that up. That's exactly what this class is intended to do. And then, of course, we'll have the exercises and quizzes each week. So this is class 3. Next week, we will focus more on the toolkit. So we're going to put all of this together, spend some time looking at the toolkit, and we will really be looking at how the library reference model is changing the toolkit and how the terminology that we've discussed and some of the ideas and sort of the realignment of these bibliographic and authoritative models have changed sort of how we view our data, how we view what we're doing, and then how that's impacting the RDA toolkit. So next week we'll kind of put it together. We're going to do a quick review today, just kind of touch on some of the high points of what we talked about, and then we'll dive right into authorities and really focus a lot on names and subjects. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of where I see all of that going, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the whole concept of aggregation or aggregating or aggregate. So we'll talk about that because that's kind of a new term for us and it really kind of changes things a little bit. And then finally, we're going to talk about serials because there's actually a whole section on serials just in the library reference model. So if you've not made it that far through the library reference model, you'll be reading about it more this week and talking about more this week. Of course, I think we all realize the world has changed in terms of how data is handled, how we use data, oh gosh, even what devices we use to access data, right? That has just changed so much. And when you think about someone who maybe went to school sort of before the computer age and how they went to the library and how they would access things, they would have to look in the catalog, they would consult with, often consult with librarians and other people to get information. And so they would have a more guided experience, I would say. I mean, we still had serendipity and people still went to the library and just kind of browsed and looked for things, or, you just kind of went there and kind of hoped you could find something without really understanding how it worked. But for the most part, it was a very, in terms of how it was intended to be, it was a very guided experience where subject headings lead you to a specific direction. It's a very hierarchical, and so a lot of the sort of that experience was meant to guide you from broad to general or general to broad. And we did have some related topics, but often if you got into a particular subject area, it was much easier to go up or down the hierarchy than to kind of go sideways or go out of the hierarchy and find something differently. So it was a very hierarchical, very structured sort of approach. Of course, that's kind of how the web itself evolved in the early days, right? It was very structured. If you wanted to do something in the web, and most of us don't even remember, or many of us don't remember a whole lot about the early days of the web, but if you really think about what you did in those early days, sort of before social media and all that, if you were actually using the web in those days, then you just went and you might look at something, but you kind of just went through the pages. There wasn't a whole lot you could do. Navigation was typically very hierarchical. There wasn't a whole lot of sort of moving around and things like that. Search was very limited in terms of what you could do back then, so it was very much a guided experience. And one of the examples, which if you go look in the Internet Archive, you can still see some of those early examples of websites, but things like directories. So you went and you looked in a directory, like Yahoo had a directory, Alta Vista, there's a lot of different directories out there, but you would go look in a directory and that would guide you through a subject. Very hierarchical, often, very similar to kind of what libraries do. Of course, that's kind of all just exploded and gone in a new direction. We're having much more interconnection connection between resources. Machines are getting smarter, they're certainly getting faster. And sometimes when we think of, we hear the word smarter, really just means the machine is so much faster, it can do that computation so much faster. So, we do have some ability for the machines to actually start parsing information and making sense out of it, but more so it's just the machines are so fast that they can take all of this information and crunch it and kind of come up with something. But the idea of where we're going, or actually I think where we are now, is that we have this human content. So, we have all this stuff on the web that we are doing, that we are using. And, the data that we can read, that we can understand, which of course the data we can read for many of us in cataloging, that would be like a MARC record. We can understand and read that data. And then, of course, with the machine readable content. And that's really where we also get to that aspect of being able to link data. An RDA MARC record is starting, well, MARC record always had parts that were meant to be really more for the machines, the fixed field area. That's a very coded, machine-oriented area. There's some other areas in a MARC record that were really more for the machines than for us. And we often had titles fields that were sort of parallel in that way. So if you're doing map cataloging, you would have it like an 034, and then you would have like a 255 for your coordinates. And so those two fields, although covering some of the same functionality, one is very human readable if you understand coordinates, and one is very machine readable doesn't matter if you understand coordinates or not. Being able to parse out that information, you really need to sort of know the code, which would be that machine aspect of it. So, of course, we and all our users are very connected. We are increasingly seeing, data mashups, data being interpreted, data being remixed, all of that. That's increasingly part of that and part of what we're doing. And of course, that also means that our data is structured in a different way, and we're really starting to focus more on relationships. We've been doing this for a while, but we're starting to really increase this. And of course, the Internet of Thing is really a common term for this kind of thing. So, RDA has been out for a while now, and it really, and it came from those three frameworks. So the functional requirements for authority data, functional requirements for bibliographic records, functional requirements for subject authority data. So those were sort of, put into place, although it didn't happen all in sort of a linear fashion. So functional requirements for bibliographic records kind of came first, and then from there you had the authority data and then the subject authority data. But in the meantime, as the functional requirements for bibliographic records was sort of nailed down in that sort of first version, then you had that sort of development of RDA happening. So, and they're not all written by the same groups of people. So, you can see where that would be potential for things not to work quite seamlessly. But RDA really was meant to address some of the deficiencies in our cataloging code. So to address things like we didn't have a really good way in a MARC record to deal with a digital record or digital object. Of course, we have lots of traditional print materials, book serials. We have digital materials that are, a representation of a traditional resource, like a digitized book, an ebook that actually looks like a book. And when you're looking at an ebook, you'll look at some ebooks and they have a title page and it just looks like a scan book, right? It's just a representation of a book. And then you look at other ebooks and they might have additional content in them, they might have some media in them. They are a completely different representation. Or maybe it's just an article out of that book or a chapter out of that book. So, there's both within that sort of digital landscape, and not that it really matters terribly in terms of sort of looking at these materials, but we have some digital materials that are just meant to be a surrogate or a representation of a traditional print resource, and then we have others that are meant to kind of really be their own thing. And so, RDA really was trying to really look at that whole landscape and figure out what we were going to do, because of course our users and us ourselves as users want to be able to find that stuff. We also looked at these bigger communities like museums and archives. If you've worked in any of those communities, you know that you are using, most likely, there's not very many either museums or archives. Some archives, if they're within a library, will use MARC for some of their materials, probably most likely like traditional print resources. But they will more often use something, if it's digitized, they'll use something like Dublin Core and then some other standards to go along with it. So, that's kind of where we are. And of course, this world has kind of grown up around us. And, this is one of those areas where there's like this whole community of practice that's sort of parallel to us. Now, there's a lot of things that they do in this parallel world when you start kind of wandering out into the web world. And I know some of you have wandered out there quite a bit or spent some time out there working. There's things that about that work that they do that is very useful that we could adopt as sort of things we might want to consider. More linking between resources, easier to find, sometimes easier to find things. I guess that could be argued, but more sort of entry points into data, more relationships between data, more using resources, using data in a different way. But one thing they have not done as well, and this I say as the web as a whole is starting to look at this, is really about how we have some identity management. And that's sort of one of the hot buzzy words that's sort of been kicking around for a little while, but I think we're starting to see it increase now, is sort of this notion of, how do we separate out identities? How do we establish identities in the internet? What is our authoritative resources in terms of that? It's one thing to kind of understand controlled vocabularies and think, well, as long as you say which controlled vocabulary you're using and using a controlled vocabulary, then you've got your subject access. But we can use sort of free text and relevance ranking and all that to kind of get to topics. But then how do you, what do you do for people? So there are some starting to see, there's some projects out there we're starting to see more use and interest in controlled vocabularies, more interest in use in terms of being able to establish identities, as we do when we do authority records. Wikipedia is one place that you are starting to see this, where it's kind of expressing when there's a difference. When you have a name that will be the same otherwise, how do you express that difference? And so this is one of those things that we have done. It's a feature of our authority work. We've been doing this for years, but we're starting now to see this in sort of our community of colleagues out there in the web are really starting to look and talk about identity management and how they do this. So, in addition to starting to think about how they do it themselves, they're also starting to kind of look at our authority data, and there's starting to be projects where we are working together, or we as a community. So it might be the Library of Congress, it might be OCLC, it might be some university that's working together with Wikipedia, Wikidata, some of these other big projects to share authority data or to experiment with sharing authority data. So, there's some of that kind of stuff that's starting to happen. And I think we are going to see much more of this going forward. And, as we start to kind of think about this and think about authority data, we are the experts at doing authority data, I would say, out there in the sort of landscape of metadata control in terms of identity management. I mean, we are some of the best people in terms of a community of practice, in terms of doing identity management because we have just been doing it for so long. We have very granular rules in terms of what we control, and we are looking at, how do we talk about our creators? How do we, express the relationship, which is really one of the things we've been working on in the last few years, is how do we express that relationship of that person to that particular um, title. So, there's starting to be some projects to work across communities of practice. So I think this is going to continue to be a very interesting piece when it comes to what we do and also what these other communities do. Now, our authority work looks something like this. It's a MARC record. In terms of our official record or source, the Library of Congress does now publish these records as linked data, so you can use those in linked data. Of course, the Virtual Internet Authority file also has links that you can use, and it's pulling together resources from beyond just the authority file. But where we start with these records, where they start out, is as a MARC record, which of course that it has many challenges to it these days. For one thing, the MARC coding is of course a challenge. And, right now at this point, we're just starting to think about how we can, use more links within an authority record. So an authority record traditionally has looked very much like this. No links. It is very just text information and then MARC coding. So, human readable, certainly, but we have just not, really looked at how we can explore that. Of course, the authorized form of the name, so this would be the name that we choose as the established form of the name, appears in the 100 field of an authority record. That then matches what you would put into a 100, 600, or 700 field in a bibliographic record, along with those subfield E relator codes to express that relationship. My authority record's a pretty good example. If you want to go look at it, it's pretty full. There's a lot in there. Doesn't cover everything, but it does cover a lot. So, that is one of the things that we have done with authority records, is that we have done a lot more in terms of sort of tracing a person's career in terms of what they are working on. So you will see things like, when people graduated, or what their degrees are, where they've worked, things like that. So we're starting to record some of that information to kind of help establish that person's sort of professional career or writing career as it impacts the work that they have done. Of course, we do separate people out, so we do not allow people to have the exact same name, the exact same heading in the authority file. And so, there's a gazillion Robin Fays out there. And in fact, I go look them up every once in a while just to see who's out there. And some of them have kind of dropped off the radar lately, but there's still quite a few of them kicking around. So I go see what my real estate colleague is doing, and there's a musician, go see what she's up to. So, but if you are just searching for name, you really have to be able to find some way to qualify it, just kind of separate it out. So there were some very early attempts in the web to sort of do this, to allow people to set up their identities and kind of manage that and stuff, but it just didn't really go too far. And so we're starting to there's other projects out there. Academia EDU allows you to kind of do some things to kind of set up a bio and pull together information. ORCID allows you to do the same sort of thing where you can kind of establish an identity. But they're all kind of limited. For example, for ORCID, you can't, it's more research oriented. Academia EDU is also more research oriented. So it's not as easy to put things in either one of those, sort of your authority record within those projects. It's not as easy to put things in there that are not sort of scholarly works. So if you're a person who, maybe writes a lot in your local newspaper and you want to include that, maybe you have a column there, or you're doing an editorial, or you run a blog, or you have your own website that you've been creating content on for years and things like that. It's a lot harder to put some of that information in. It's like there's not a good spot for that kind of information. So we're still kind of I think on the larger web in these projects, we're still trying to figure out like how to do that. It's like those authority projects kind of come out of various various groups. So it might come out of more the research community or like the academic community or something like that. So it's like whatever group it comes out of kind of shapes what information you can include, rather than being something that you can kind of add whatever information is about you that you want to include. And of course, they're all things that are done. Most of those things are done sort of by the person who's interested in doing that. So we do describe relationships, and I talked about this a little bit. So we add those codes to provide the relationship of the person to the title we're cataloging. And these come from a closed control vocabulary in the RDA toolkit. There was some talk one time about they might add to it, but I haven't heard of any codes being added lately, so I'm not sure if they're doing that anymore, if they've kind of feel like they've got it nailed down. One of the things that's interesting, I think, about this is that this is a place where we're providing context. So sometimes when I talk about value-added cataloging, like, if the machines are, we're getting our metadata either harvested or sent to us from like the publisher file or whatever, what value are we bringing to the data? And in addition to subject analysis, which of course is a big part of the contextual part of it, where we are actually analyzing the work to determine what those subjects are. This is another place where we provide a lot of really value-added cataloging, where we're providing that context and helping to sort of provide that information. So we are actually evaluating the work, analyzing the work, and then we're adding any names that we would need to add. The names could already be in there from the publisher if we're getting harvested metadata or some kind of publisher file, but they may not actually list all of those roles. Or if they do, they're actually going to the RDA toolkit and pulling them from that list. So if you're getting like a vendor record and it already has a lot of subfields in it, or has all the subfields, they're pulling it from that RDA toolkit list too. So, this is one of those areas where we do have the potential to add some value. So we talked about this sort of little example about Star Wars and some the relationship. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this today. But what I do want you to think about as we go forward with some of these topics is think about, first really think about those user tasks and think about how we are trying to help our users find things. So not only to find things, but have that serendipitous experience. So really we need our catalogs and our systems to be able to serve two purposes, in that online environment. The same thing as when you have a patron that comes into the library and walks up to the desk and says, I need help on a project. I'm researching, dogs. And so the librarian would kind of guide them through the process. Why you're looking for a particular kind of dog? Are you doing something? What kind of project is this you're working on? Getting at those, what we think of as, the research questions, the reference questions, trying to help the user define their topic to the point that they can find relevant resources. And we haven't really had a good way to do that in our catalogs. If you go to the desk, you have this very experienced person typically who's going to help guide you. If you're, um, you're a fifth grader coming up to the desk and you say, I need help, I have a paper due on dogs. If you are a sophomore in college and you come up to the reference desk in the academic library and you say, I have a paper due tomorrow, I'm doing a paper on dogs. Now, as the person working at the desk, or if you're even different desk, you're going to evaluate your user. You're going to get a sense of what level of resource is appropriate to them. The sophomore may be a vet med major, and they're starting to look at the impact of some veterinarian technique on the longevity of and the lifespan of dogs. And so you've got to dig in and figure out they're looking for more scholarly research oriented articles or resources on this particular thing. Whereas the fifth grader comes in, they're just really doing like a history of dogs. They just want to know about like where dogs came from and something like that. But getting to those topics and getting to the appropriate level requires some work and collaboration between the patron and the person at the desk, right? And so that's a process that we haven't done a really good job of building into our systems. Like, how do we guide our users and help our users find things? And we've had very granular searches. You know, you want to advance search, you know exactly what you want to search. So the other one is, you know, the person who comes up to the desk, or they probably don't even come up to the desk because they know exactly what they're looking for, right? I want, um, I want the um, Sue Grisham novel, G is for Guilty. You know, they know exactly, I can't remember if that's the name of it or not, but anyway, they know exactly what they're looking for. They're not looking for anything else. They're looking exactly for that. And so they know exactly what they want to do. And so one of the things I think we're at a challenge with the system development, at least, is how do we facilitate all of the different user experiences our users need in one system, in one software. And that's a big, tall order, right? Because how do we facilitate the user who knows exactly what they want? They don't want anything else. They just want that one thing. And, you know, maybe they're even more granular. I want Sue Grisham's G is for Guilty in a large print format. And I want print. I don't want any digital. I want print. They know exactly what they want, you know, down to that. Then, you know, how do you make it easy for that person to find just that? And then also allow for the person who comes in and like, well, you know, I'm a fifth grader doing a book on dogs. How do you guide them to find what they're looking for? And then how do you help the patron who is, you know, I read the latest Sue Grisham novel, and that was just fantastic. And, you know, she's not writing anymore. So what else can I read that's like that? You know, how do we facilitate all of those different experiences? So how do we facilitate the user who knows what they're looking for? Exactly. They don't want anything else. They just want that thing. How do we facilitate the user who needs a more guided experience and some help along the way to help them define their topic, or help them get to help them express the topic that they actually need to be looking for, as opposed to dogs, they need something more, you know, more granular than that. And then how do we help the person who is just, you know, they want to just explore and find something else. So we've talked about these terms in the past, but we're going to talk more about exactly what these mean. So entities are work, expression, manifestations, items, person. So for what we're talking about today, mostly person, families, corporate bodies, those are all things, and subjects, so entities. And then of course, attributes or characteristics. So for authorities, because we're going to be really focused more on authorities today, examples of attributes are birth or death date, the language of a person or corporate body, place of residence, full form of the name, gender, things like that. Attributes do appear in authority records. So some of those things about related to people are things that would appear in the authority record. Preferred name, that's the basis of where we create the name. So, you know, the first time that I had someone create an authority record for me, they contacted me and asked me some information, and I gave them some information back, and that was the basis of, you know, creating my name. And then the authorized access point, which is the combination of the preferred name along with any attributes that you're going to include, and then the relator codes. So for copy cataloging, this is the name that appears in the authority record. It's also the name that should match in your 100, 600, or 700 for that particular name. And then for original cataloging, that is the name the cataloger constructs following those specific guidelines. So examples of some attributes, gender, date of birth, date of death, place of birth, associated country, affiliation, language, profession, occupation, etc. And then, of course, entities can have relationships with other entities. So you could say corporate body B is the successor of corporate body A. The person is the founder of the corporate body. So this is the relationship of that person to to another name. So we could have, the relationship of Sprite to Coca-Cola, those kind of relationships. And then, of course, you have a relationship of a person to the work, things like that. So there are relationships all over the data, and we've looked at this before, but there's relationships all over the data. So not only is there relationships in terms of the bibliographic data itself, there's also then all of the relationships when it relates to the people involved in creating the works that we catalog and the subjects of the works that we catalog. So, from an authority standpoint, looking at this great model, it's been kicking around for a while, but it is a great model, looking at the subject and the authority aspect of it, you have for the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown is the author. You have It's the Last Supper, so there's your topic. And then the Last Supper, of course, you have that relationship between the artist and the work, the Last Supper, because it is about the Last Supper, which is of course a work by another, in this case an artist. So we have all of those relationships that are related, and this is one of the areas that we have not, I think we're just now starting in the last few years, we've really been starting to put more relationships into our MARC records, and we're talking much more about relationships because they've always existed, right? If a author writes a book about an artist, there's the relationship between the author and that book, right? The author and that work. But then there's also that relationship of the artist that the author's writing about. And then there's also the relationship between those two, but between the work as well. And then if it's about a particular topic, about the topic as well. So we have so many relationships, and of course we've looked at this chart before, but what I wanted to focus on here is how the kinds of different relationships we may find. So between persons, families, corporate bodies, and works, between names and persons, families, corporate bodies, and works, and between control access points. So we have relationships between all of those. And these relationships have existed. We have just not defined them or coded them in any way up until recent years. So when you looked at an early MARC record, or you looked at a MARC record before RDA, you looked at a MARC record before this, you would know, or you could assume based upon the information of the one in the 100 field and its relationship to the 245. So that relationship between the authorized form of the name in the 100 field and the statement of responsibility in the 245, you could assume that the person that wrote the book was in that statement of responsibility, because that was the information recorded there. But you could also assume that that was the 100. So you could assume or infer that when you looked at the statement of responsibility in the 245, who it listed by, you could infer or assume that that was the author, but it wasn't actually coded in any way to tell you that was the author. I mean, our rules would tell us that was the author, but that really meant that we were sort of unconsciously, and our patrons were too, analyzing it, right? You would look at that information where it said, G is for guilty by Sue Grisham, and you would look at the by Sue Grisham and you would understand, because of the word by and the relationship of that word to the title, you would assume that was the author. And it would be the correct assumption, but it wasn't actually coded in any way. So that's sort of where the relator codes are coming in. We're trying to actually code those relationships instead of providing the information and then people are having to make that analysis or assumption. Now, it's not a very hard thing to do when you see G is for guilty by Sue Grisham, to look at that and understand that by Sue Grisham means that that is the person who wrote that book. I mean, that's an easy thing to understand if you understand English, if you understand sort of what those words mean. if you can read those words, all of that kind of thing, or hear those words, hear somebody read them to you, all of those things you can infer or assume. If you can understand what that means, the words actually mean, then you can actually, you can make that assumption. But from a computer standpoint, it doesn't have all the same capabilities that we have in terms of understanding, and fallacies and other disadvantages and all those other things that are part of being human. But it doesn't have that ability to be able to make sense of that necessarily. So it's, it has to be able to, it can make some judgment, things like that, the same way that we can, but having that information coded in a way that um, is a little more coded and actually defining that relationship does make it easier for everybody. So then when you're looking at a record, you can also, then it makes it a lot easier to start pulling out a lot more names. Because if you have a record, especially an older record, and you just have a whole bunch of 700 fields where you just list a bunch of people, for example, a movie, you just list like 15 people involved in the movie. Well, without looking at the box or watching the movie for the credits, you're not going to know all those relationships that those people have. You might be able to guess that Brad Pitt's the actor, but maybe Brad Pitt directed it. And so without some information in that record to tell you that, either, textual information, movie directed by Brad Pitt, or starring Brad Pitt, without some information to tell you what that person's role is, very contextual, uncoded kind of information to tell you that, you're not going to know just from looking at the data. So you would have to actually then look at the piece to kind of determine what that person's role is. So that's sort of one of the reasons that we're really looking at relator codes more and thinking more about the relationships, because it's not that we're really thinking a great deal more about the relationships, because the relationships have always been there. All the people that are a cast, that are part of a movie production, those roles, yeah, they change and their titles change just like our titles change and stuff like that as jobs change and stuff. But the work that they do to do a movie, that's still, you still have the actors, you still have the directors. In fact, you probably have more people working on sets these days than less. But all those people and all the roles that they do, the work that they do to make a movie, it still happens. Might happen a little differently. They have different titles, all that kind of stuff. But if you record all of those people to give them sort of these people are all involved in this. It's not just one person who created this movie. You have all these people who had a hand in making this. Then you need to be able to find a way to also then to define those relationships so that both the system can define that information and use it, and so that users can as well. So relator codes, we're not going to talk too much more about relationships, but just think about sort of, every place that data is connected is a potential for us to have a relationship and to have a relator code, a relationship point. So think about that as we go forward, and then continue to think about and frame your thinking in our users. And in terms of framing and thinking about our users, don't just think about like, are our users going to be able to understand the word aggregate, or will they understand the word nomen? Because they're not going to be seeing that. We're the ones who are seeing and thinking about this and talking about it. The end goal of this is for us to have systems that work for everybody. And so as we think about serials and as we talk about some of the potential changes for serials, I know that, the national committees are sort of talking about a lot and sort of going through right now in terms of serials and things like that. As we think about that, really the end goal is for our users to be able to find things and for us to be able to have the experience that we need to have in our ILSs. And it may be true that we do not have ILSs that are able to achieve all of this yet, but the terminology that we're looking at today is not things that our users hopefully will be exposed to. I would hope that people who are working with ILSs would not expose users to these terms, right? The idea is that we can build better systems based upon where we're going in RDA so that our users can have all of those experiences we've discussed. So we've already talked a lot about Ferber, so we're really not going to touch on Ferber today at all. We're really going to talk about the functional requirements authority data, and we're going to just hit sort of the theoretical parts of it and kind of how it fits in with where we're going. And then we're going to talk about the subject authority data. So that's where our focus for today are those two. Of course, our group one, that's our Ferber, that's our products. So that's, that products that we're working on. Group two is who's responsible for the content, production, or custodianships of group one. So that was the products. So I know the groups our group names are kind of gone away, and I think I'm glad about that because I think that made it a little bit more confusing. But essentially, FRAD, the authority group, are those that are responsible for the products that we are cataloging, whatever those products may be, resources, whatever you want to call them, products or resources, whatever works for you. And then the last group, which is the subjects, they are just literally subjects. And so subjects can include everything, right? It can be everything in group one. So it's what is the subject of the resource you're cataloging, or it could be, you're cataloging something about a person. So what is they are the subject, right? And originally they defined it as concept, object, event, and place. And so, this got kind of, I think mired might be a good word for it. I think it got a little bit mired in terms of trying to define something like a concept, something that was so broad. And so when we talk about Nomen, one of the things I want you to think about is like what a hard thing it is to sort of define this big topic. And so they sort of scratched defining concept, and they've sort of taken a different approach. So just think about like if you were to have to write down a definition of concept and you couldn't use Wikipedia, you actually had to make it up, how much time that might take. Because you might say, well, a concept is an idea, but it is really more than that. And if you're trying to think about it in terms of data modeling, then it gets, I think, even stickier. Like, what actually is a concept? And a concept includes everything and kind of impacts everything, right? So a concept could be, the idea of a book. It could be, you have like a concept car, you have this sort of idea of a project, but it's much more than just an idea. Although that's certainly a big part of concept. So, I think it was a big topic to try to define in terms of subjects. And really what we're trying to get to is sort of defining that sort of topical thing, right? So we'll talk more about that. So when we look at the terminology for the subjects, just kind of think about sort of like, it's a big topic to try to come up with a word for. I think event and place feel much more, much more tangible. Like we recognize an event. We can see an event. We understand what an event means. Place is the same thing. We understand what those mean. And when you think about hierarchy, event and place could be in part of a hierarchy of something else. So we're going to be looking more at the right side of this in our subjects and our names. This is another take on those entities. And the reason why we're looking at these now is because although these get squished in, it's a good exercise in kind of thinking about how these things fit together. Because we have the work, expression, manifestation, right? That's our WIMI there. That is sort of what would go into the general bibliographic bucket. And then we have our authorities. That would be our group, what was called group 2, but that would be our authorities over here. This is where agent will come in, and we're going to look at all that in just a second. And then we have our subjects down here. And of course, everything can, you can see here, has subject, has subject, has subject. Everything can be a subject, depending on what your work is. So we looked at this one before, but we're just going to kind of look at this again because I think this one is a good one too. So our FERBR up here, work expression manifestation item, that's a hierarchy there. And you see all the has subject, has subject, has subject. So there's a relationship that exists between every aspect. And this is one piece that we are starting to really explore in our data, but I think we still have some work to do in terms of how this is actually going to work together in the systems. And then, in our olden days, we had the concept of object, event, and place. Those were never defined as a hierarchy because that part of it was not finished. However, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not they would be even or hierarchy or partial hierarchy, but it was never actually completely finished. So they were always just kind of left as like kind of equal. And then person, corporate, and family body, those were considered to be three distinct buckets, not a hierarchy in the olden days of the functional requirements of Authority Day. The only one that had a hierarchy was FERBR, which is the WIMI, work expression manifestation item. And we talked, I think in class 1, about part of the idea was that you could have information that would be common across different versions. And so, if you have all the different versions of Dracula, all the different versions and formats of Romeo and Juliet, then you could have information that would inherit down from a work record. So you wouldn't need to record that information again. If you're recording something that's Romeo and Juliet, then if you had a work record that was kind of sitting up there on the top, then your collective title, Romeo and Juliet, would come down, your subjects would come down, your authorized access points for William Shakespeare would come down to your record. Or if it didn't inherit down to where you could actually see it, you might know that because you have a work record that it's linking to, you just only need to do the title on your piece and describe your piece. So essentially what you would do in that environment is you wouldn't need to do any authorized access points. You wouldn't do any authority work because that would be done at that work level. And it would either link to it with your record, however your system would do it, or it might inherit it down and actually kind of populate it or display it. May not actually display it in your record, but would at least populate it or display it in your record so that you could see it as you're cataloging. But essentially it would remove authority work from copy cataloging, or from copy cataloging where there's another version. So I don't want to completely exempt you if you're a copy cataloger from authority work, because you would have to do some time. But it would also mean that in terms of data management, in terms of identity management, you would fix it at the work record, and then that information could inherit down. So you would really have very little authority work that you would need to do. Where you might have some authority work that you would do, like I said, you don't completely get exempted for copy cataloging, is if you had something that was like an illustrated work. And so, if the original was not illustrated, but what you had was illustrated, then you would need to put in information for the illustrator, or maybe a movie or something like that. But there was a whole discussion even in the early days about could we have works within works. And so, when you have a big title like Romeo and Juliet or Dracula, where there's so many versions and editions and things like that, that idea of having a work within a work so that you could even have more information that kind of inherited down or populated or linked to is a really interesting idea. So we've never fully gotten to that. So like there's been some attempts out there to do a FERBRized catalog, and there's work records and things like that, but I don't know that I haven't seen any ILS that has really taken this to heart and has really created this. And of course, part of it is then you have to have a bunch of mark records that are work records, right? So you have to have that like master work record that's at the top in order to get this all happening. So it would be a lot of work to, to get that to work. I just can't stop saying that now. Anyway, but there's that idea that you could reuse data. So in theory, if we ever get here, it would help people. And then agents, of course, they're related. You have that relationship, and then you have that relationship of your subjects. So in the LRM, what stays? WIMI, the hierarchy for bibliographic data authorities with different terms and hierarchy. RDA, of course, the concept of bibliographic and authority data, that'd be subject and names. Our terminology is more in line with the semantic web communities. FERBR user test plus explore. We have res, which is our superclass of other entities, and then we have our super, which is our higher, and our sub, which is lower. And I think this may be where I'm going to stop for, do just a couple more, and then I'm going to stop for part one because this is going to be really long. RDA updated relationships. So the updated sort of what we thought about relationships. We started defining relationships a little bit more, and we defined a specific association between our two RDA entities. We formally called this relationship designators. I think we'll probably keep calling them relationship designators or relator codes for a while, but it is really just that association between two RDA entities. A attribute, of course, is a characteristic of an RDA entity, and examples are content type, dimensions, and attribute is largely unchanged, except we've just sort of embraced the term of attribute. Same thing with entity, like work is sort of still the same definition for now, so our definitions haven't changed too much yet in terms of what constitutes a work, expression, manifestation, item. So, that has not changed too much, but it is starting to change. RDA entity, so there's sort of two things. There's RDA entities, meaning, any sort of anything in this model. And then there's this RDA entity, sort of our master entity in RDA. So this is at the highest level RDA, and this is what slots us into the LRM. So the LRM has at the top res, and then we just plug right in under res with our RDA entity. And then we can pull in kind of everything below it. So I think that's kind of a confusing term because we have sort of RDA entities as general, and then we have the RDA entity, which is sort of our, our master entity for us in terms of where it fits in. So the RDA entity is that the big entity that fits at the top is that abstract class of key conceptual objects. And this is really where we plug into the LRM. It is our plugin. This is our top entity in the RDA model, and it encompasses everything else. So, whatever works for you to make it easy to remember. It's the entity of all entities in RDA. The master entity, whatever it is, whatever term it is that helps you kind of separate and understand the difference between those. It is defined as being more narrow than res because it is where we plug in. Now, because we are cataloging in RDA and we're really talking about this in RDA, in some ways you could say, well, do we even need to really know about res? Because if where we're coming into it, our entry point is the RDA entity, and it's below res, what do we really need to know about res? And that's a good question because we need to know the terminology because of res because it appears in the model, but really we're kind of coming in below that. So everything we're going to be concerned about in terms of cataloging, in terms about how we think about this model, if you're using RDA, if you go over to the archival community and you're using Dublin Core and you're going to be thinking about your metadata in a different way, you could use the LRM and apply it in some different way. But if you're using RDA, we're plugging in at this RDA entity level. You really don't need to know a whole lot more about res except to know that it's sort of the master thing of everything up there, right? It's our bibliographic universe. So, RDA cataloging, we're looking at RDA entities and below. If we go over to that archival community, we could still be using the LRM, but we might even come up with some other plug to plug us into the LRM. We might have, Dublin Core entity might be what we're using over there. And I haven't really followed what they're doing in terms of Dublin Core and the library reference model. So I don't know if that's what they're calling it or if they're looking at it, but anyway. But we could use, we could plug in that way. So in terms of RDA cataloging, do you need to know too much about res? Not really, other than to know the term and be familiar with it. If you put on your archival, metadata worker hat, do you need to know res? If you're using the library reference model and you're not cataloging in RDA, then you probably do. So that's, I think, where that kind of falls out. Hopefully that helps kind of make sense of that. And of course, the other thing about it, having this model that where we're just plugging in and then kind of using everything below it, it allows for referring from an RDA entity model to outside of RDA. So that allows us to potentially make our data more portable, interoperable, and transferable in the future. So, you know, they're sort of putting in place by sort of creating this RDA entity and plugging us into the library reference model that way. They're creating a way for us to, or not creating a way, but really creating that philosophy of sharing and being more interoperable just by the framework and the hierarchy itself. So do we need a hierarchy and a philosophical framework, a conceptual framework of data modeling to tell us that we should share data between IRs and library catalogs, digital repositories and library catalogs, institutional archives and library catalogs? No, I'd say, right? But when you start looking at building a system and you're starting to look at how you're going to model your data, then at that point, or maybe you're starting your own one of these projects and you're starting to look at you know, contributing code, or there's going to be a new version of it coming out and they've asked for feedback, being able to think about the modeling in that way and thinking about the model of the library reference model for RDA cataloging, thinking about how the library reference model could work for your particular metadata work and cataloging of your repository. Thinking about that and structuring your data in that way, or building the framework in the way that facilitates that, would help build a more interoperable system that works together and transferable metadata. So it does have the ability to do that. And on that note, I am going to stop for part one, and I will finish up part two this afternoon. I'm going to try to do it in smaller bits and see if that helps in terms of the recording. So thank you, and I will see you shortly for part two.